She was paid to pour wine and stay invisible, until her hands spoke louder than the billionaires at her table. The ballroom shimmered like a palace. Crystal chandeliers scattered gold across silk gowns and tailored suits. Silver trays floated between tables, carried by staff in pressed uniforms. No one looked twice at them, especially not at Maya Carter, the black single mom refilling glasses along the edge of the gala. She was meant to blend into the wallpaper, polite and silent, until the billionaire's mother tried to order. The older woman tapped the menu, lips moving soundlessly. The waiter beside her froze. The table stiffened. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some forcing brittle smiles, others exchanging awkward glances. Nobody knew what to do. Maya's steps faltered. She recognized the hand gestures, subtle and shaky. American Sign Language. Without thinking, she set the tray down and moved closer. Her fingers lifted, precise and fluid. "Would you like sparkling water, or still?" The woman's face lit up. Relief washed over her features as her hands fluttered back. Graceful, grateful. The two began to converse with ease, their silent dialogue flowing faster than words. The table froze. Forks stopped midway to lips. Glasses trembled. Conversations died. All eyes turned to the waitress who wasn't supposed to exist, who had just broken the silence in a language most of them couldn't even name. Across the table, Alexander Romano, the billionaire himself, lowered his glass of red wine. For the first time that evening, his mask of calm cracked. His gaze sharpened, piercing through the soft glow of candlelight, and locked onto Maya. "Where did you learn that?" he asked quietly, voice rough with surprise. The words weren't loud, but the entire table heard them. And so did Maya. Her pulse spiked. Heat rushed into her cheeks. Every instinct screamed to back away, to fade into the background where she belonged. She forced a small smile, eyes darting. "I just picked it up." Romano leaned forward, expression unreadable, wineglass forgotten. "Not at that level," he murmured. "You're fluent. Where?" The room seemed to shrink. Waitstaff exchanged looks. Guests whispered, eyebrows arched. A mechanic's daughter, a struggling waitress. How could she possibly know something so refined, so rare? Maya's throat tightened. She shouldn't have answered, shouldn't have revealed herself. But the truth slipped out before she could stop it. "Columbia," she whispered. The word fell like a stone into water, rippling through the room. The billionaire's eyes narrowed, his silence heavier than any accusation. Guests shifted, confused. Her hands trembled as she retrieved the tray, desperate to move, to disappear again. But it was too late. With one slip, the past she had buried under years of exhaustion and invisibility cracked open, and the man with the power to unearth it all had just found his reason to dig. The gala carried on, but for Maya every sound was muted. The clink of cutlery, the murmur of laughter, the strings of the quartet, all muffled beneath the pounding of her own heartbeat. She had said too much. "Columbia!" The word still echoed in her head like a curse. She tried to bury it beneath a polite smile, lowering her gaze and retreating to the safety of the shadows with her tray. But shadows couldn't erase the weight of Alexander Romano's eyes following her. She slipped into the service corridor, leaning against the wall. Other waitstaff brushed past, whispering. One of them smirked, voice low but sharp enough to slice. "She's just a waitress. People like her don't study abroad." The words stung. People like her. She had heard that phrase too many times, at job interviews, in classrooms, at offices where her ideas had been dismissed before she finished her sentence. A black woman with too much knowledge? Too polished? Too articulate? Always doubted, always invisible, unless someone needed proof they weren't biased. She forced herself to keep moving, but her mind drifted back to a lab lit by computer screens, to long nights of code and coffee, to laughter that once felt safe. Back to David. He had been her fiancé, her partner in everything. or so she believed. Together they sketched patents on napkins, wrote algorithms that caught the eye of investors and promised each other the future. But futures can be stolen, and David had stolen hers. She remembered the night she confronted him, papers spread across their kitchen table. These signatures, why is my name missing? Her voice had trembled with disbelief. David's reply had been a smirk. You're overreacting. It's just paperwork. No one would have taken you seriously anyway. Days later, the journals published their research, except her name was gone. Weeks later, the investors signed deals, except she was nowhere on the paperwork, and by the time she realized the full scale of what he'd done, the betrayal was complete. He had erased her. Now, here she was, years later, serving wine under chandeliers while her stolen legacy built someone else's empire. At the head table, Romano swirled his glass absent-mindedly, still watching her. His mind churned with questions. Waitresses didn't casually know sign language. They didn't accidentally let Columbia slip. He signaled his head of staff. "Pull her file," he murmured. Minutes later, a tablet was placed discreetly in his hand. He scrolled through the HR record. Birth date, address, job start date, but no academic history, no mention of Columbia, no publications, no research, nothing before 5 years ago, scrubbed clean. Romano frowned. In his world, files were never that empty unless someone wanted them to be. Back in the service wing, Maya poured coffee for guests, forcing herself into the rhythm of her shift. But her thoughts were elsewhere, memories bleeding into the present, bitterness scraping her raw. Then the ballroom lights dimmed. A hush fell. All eyes turned to the giant screens mounted above the stage as the MC announced a special news update. The ticker scrolled across the bottom first, a headline bold enough to suck the air from Maya's lungs. David Mercer announces historic merger with Romano Enterprises. Her tray rattled in her hands. The room erupted in applause. Guests cheered. Romano's expression hardened as his gaze flicked to her again. For Maya, the words weren't just news. They were a death sentence. The past she'd tried to bury had just walked into the very room she was trapped in. The ballroom thundered with applause as David Mercer strode onto the stage, sharp in his midnight blue suit, charm painted across his face. Cameras flashed. Investors leaned forward. The MC boomed his name like a king returning from war. Maya's breath caught. Her tray wobbled in her hands, a glass nearly toppling. It was him, the man who had stolen her work, her future, and her voice. She tried to slip into the shadows, but her eyes betrayed her. They locked on David, wide with panic, frozen in a storm only she could feel. Across the room, Alexander Romano caught it. He noticed the way her shoulders stiffened, the glass rattling against its tray, the way color drained from her face. His gaze sharpened, suspicion hardening into certainty. This waitress and his new partner had history. On stage, David spread his arms, soaking in the applause. "Tonight marks the beginning of a new empire," he declared. His voice hadn't changed. Smooth, confident, convincing. The same voice that once whispered promises into Maya's ear. The same voice that turned to poison when she confronted him. Her mind reeled back to the night everything cracked. She remembered standing in their small apartment, papers clutched in her hands, shaking. "David, why is my name gone from the patent filing?" Her voice had been barely above a whisper. He hadn't flinched. He'd smiled that infuriating lazy smile and slid the papers away. "You're imagining things." "I saw it." Her throat had burned. "We wrote this together." His sigh had been sharp, annoyed. "Anna, nobody is going to believe you. Not the investors, not the lawyers. You don't present well. You freeze. You stumble. You look nervous. They'll never put millions behind you." Tears had filled her eyes. "It's mine, too. You know it is." He'd leaned close, eyes cold. "No, it's mine now. You're lucky I even let you ride along this far. Without me, you're nothing." And with that, he had erased her, not just from papers, but from possibility. Maya blinked back to the present, her hands trembling. Around her, gala guests clapped for a man they thought was a visionary. None of them knew he was a thief. Romano leaned toward his aide, murmuring. Within moments, David's voice carried not just across the ballroom, but into the private speakerphone Romano held at his table. "Mr. Mercer," Romano said smoothly, his words sharp enough to cut. "Our staff tells me you've impressed half the city. I like to know the men I work with. Tell me, do you know everyone in this room?" There was a pause, the faint shuffle of papers, then David's laugh. "I meet a lot of people, Mr. Romano. Waiters, interns, investors, they all blur together." Romano's gaze slid toward Maya, watching her flinch. "And a woman named Anna Carter," he pressed. On the other end, silence. A silence that stretched so long the room seemed to hold its breath. Then David chuckled, low and dismissive. "Anna, who?" The words landed like a blade. Maya's breath hitched, tears pricking her eyes. She pressed a trembling hand against the tray to steady it, but nothing could stop the collapse inside her chest. In front of the billionaire, in front of the city, David had denied her existence again. Clean, casual, cruel. And this time, the world was listening. Maya barely made it through the rest of the gala. Every laugh from the crowd, every cheer for David Mercer felt like salt rubbed into an open wound. The man who had stolen everything was not only free, he was being crowned as a visionary. And once again, he had erased her in front of everyone. Back in her tiny apartment that night, she sat at the table long after her son was asleep. Bills, unopened letters, and scraps of half-finished sketches littered the surface. She stared at the glow of her old laptop, the cursor blinking like a dare. For years, she had told herself it wasn't worth it, that no one would listen, that maybe David was right. Nobody would ever take her seriously. But Romano's eyes at the gala, those told a different story. He had seen the crack in the mask. He had heard the slip in David's voice, and she had heard her son's question earlier that week echoing in her mind. "Mom, why don't people believe you?" Her throat tightened. She whispered back to herself, "Because I never showed them." Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Passwords she hadn't typed in years, email accounts she had abandoned. Each click was a shovel digging into the grave David had buried her in. And then, files. The patents, draft versions, attachments with her name and metadata, emails where David forwarded her research from her account to his, just minutes before official filings. Old photographs, her hand on the whiteboard, diagrams scrawled in her writing. David standing beside her, smile sharp, already rehearsing betrayal. The proof was all there. Not neat, not polished, but undeniable. Her heart pounded as she gathered it into a folder, labeled it simply, Receipts. Hours later, she stood in the marble halls of Romano's private office, clutching a flash drive. Guards eyed her suspiciously, but Romano himself waved her in. The billionaire sat behind a desk of dark oak, the city lights sprawling behind him like a conquered kingdom. Maya laid the drive down gently, her hands steady. "This isn't a favor," she said firmly. "It isn't charity. This is the truth. He stole from me. He erased me. And you deserve to know exactly who you're about to let into your empire." Romano studied her, then slid the drive into his laptop. Silence stretched as he clicked through files, each image reflected in his eyes. Her name on early drafts, timestamps, the stolen ideas. His jaw tightened. Finally, he leaned back, folding his hands. "Truth," he said quietly, "is powerful." He let the word hang before adding, "But dangerous in this room." Maya's stomach nodded. "So you'll bury it too?" Romano shook his head slowly. "No. But understand, men like David don't fall without dragging others with them. If you step forward, you won't walk back to being invisible. You'll be a target. She met his gaze without flinching. I already am. For the first time, a flicker of respect passed through his eyes. Not pity, not amusement, respect. Before he could speak further, the double doors at the far end of the office creaked open. Footsteps echoed against marble. Maya turned, pulse spiking, and there he was. David Mercer. Smiling. The boardroom gleamed like a temple of power, polished mahogany tables stretching the length of the room, floor-to-ceiling windows pouring dawn light over a skyline that bent to money. Around the table sat men in suits worth more than Maya's yearly rent, cufflinks flashing, watches ticking like a metronome of control. Maya stood just inside the doorway, palms slick, heart battering against her ribs. She was the only one not dressed for war in silk and steel. Just a black dress borrowed from the estate wardrobe, plain shoes, her hair tied back. Outsider written all over her. At the head of the table, Alexander Romano lounged in his chair, cigar smoldering in a crystal tray. His silence commanded more authority than the buzz of conversation around him. David Mercer stood near the screen, clicking through slides of projections, revenue curves, words like synergy and innovation spilling from his mouth. The men nodded along, hypnotized by numbers. "Tonight, we sign the papers," David declared smoothly. "By morning, Romano Enterprises and Mercer Tech will be unstoppable." Applause. A few smirks. Romano lifted his hand and the room stilled. "Before we sign," Romano said, voice low but carrying across the room, "we need transparency." David blinked, his salesman smile faltering. "Of course. Any questions?" Romano's eyes cut toward the door. "Yes, one question." The double doors opened wider. Maya stepped forward, clutching a thin folder. The air changed. Heads swiveled. Brows arched. A murmur rippled down the table. David's face drained of color. "What is she doing here?" Romano leaned back, smoke curling above his head. "She has something you forgot to disclose." Maya's legs wanted to fold beneath her, but she kept walking, each step echoing like a drum. She laid the folder on the table, her fingers steady as she spread its contents. Photographs, time-stamped code snippets, patent drafts with metadata glowing in print. "This," she said firmly, "is mine. My name. My work. Every file here shows I built what you claimed. You didn't erase the evidence, you just buried it. But I dug it back up." The room went silent. Suits leaned closer. Pages slid across the table as men in ties examined the proof. David's voice broke the silence, too loud, too sharp. "She's lying. She's just a waitress, a nobody. Look at her." A few voices murmured, the undertone heavy. "Credibility. Out of place here. How would she even—" Maya's chest burned, but she lifted her chin. She had lived this moment 100 times before. In offices, in labs, in classrooms. Always doubted, always dismissed. But not this time. Romano's hand came down on the table with a sharp crack. The murmurs died. His eyes were fire as they cut through the smoke. "She doesn't need your permission to exist," he said, voice cold steel. He looked straight at David. "You erased her name. She's here to reclaim it." The words rang across the room, heavier than any signature on paper. David sputtered, reaching for his slides, his voice climbing in pitch. "She has no credibility. She—" Romano lifted a hand. 2 guards stepped forward. David spun, eyes wild. "You can't do this, Alex. We're partners." "Not anymore." Romano's voice was final. "I don't build empires with thieves." The guards seized David by the arms. He struggled, his polished shoes squealing against marble until he realized the futility. His eyes flicked once to Maya, venom spilling from them before he was dragged from the room. The silence he left behind was deafening. Maya stood trembling but taller than she ever had. For once the room wasn't erasing her. They were seeing her. Romano stubbed out his cigar and stood. "The merger is halted," he said simply. The boardroom erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in outrage and panic. But for Maya, it was the sweetest silence of her life. The boardroom slowly emptied after David's humiliating exit, but the storm of voices still echoed in Maya's ears. Arguments, outrage, the shuffle of expensive shoes retreating down the corridor, yet, for the first time, none of it was aimed at her. She stood at the far end of the table, documents spread before her like reclaimed ground. Her proof, her name, her history, no longer erased. Alexander Romano stepped closer, his presence filling the room. For a long moment, he simply studied her, the same way he had when she first signed to his mother. But this time, his gaze wasn't suspicion. It was respect. "You've done more in one night," he said quietly, "than most men at this table will do in a lifetime." Maya steadied her breath. She expected him to dismiss her now that David was gone, to sweep her aside like so many others had. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded sheet, and slid it across the table. A contract. "A position in my company," he said. "Resources, security, and more money than you've seen in a decade." Maya looked down at the papers. Her name was printed clearly this time. No erasures, no missing lines. Her fingers brushed the edge, but she didn't pick it up. She lifted her eyes, steady, refusing the easy awe he expected. "If I stay," she said firmly, "it's not as your charity case, not to be paraded as proof of your fairness. If I stay, it's as an equal, not invisible again." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. Romano's lips curved into something faintly resembling a smile. He nodded once, the gesture sharp, decisive. "Equal, then," he said. "Not less, never less." Something in her chest loosened. For years, she had bent herself small, folded into shadows. Now, she unfolded. She slipped the papers into her bag, her hand brushing against the worn wrench tucked inside, the one she always carried for roadside emergencies, for her mechanic shifts, for survival. A tool that had kept her afloat when the world tried to drown her. Beside it now lay the signed contract, ink still fresh, old survival and new dignity side by side. She turned toward the glass doors at the end of the corridor. Sunlight streamed through them, spilling across marble floors. Each step she took toward it was lighter than the last. At the doorway, a small figure waited. Her son. His eyes lit up when he saw her, his smile wide and unguarded. "Mom!" he called, running into her arms. She held him close, breathing in the simple, grounding scent of home. Not erased, not doubted, not invisible. She was here. She was whole. She was believed. As she stepped into the sunlight, the question lingered like a challenge, daring anyone who had once dismissed her to answer honestly. Would you have believed her? Or doubted her too?